Sure, the Chicago Bears haven't put all their resources into directly building around Justin Fields, and that's not ideal, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to take that and then say that the team isn't committed to Justin Fields or confident enough in Justin Fields to put those resources around him. I'm not buying it.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we're talking about what the Bears did in the draft and the application to Justin Fields. Obviously, not using those 2 second-round picks on offense, instead going on defense. And on yesterday's podcast, we talked a little bit more about the value of that and trying to separate these ideas a little bit of like good draft, good picks versus also not using those picks on field and how those things can exist at the same time. Go back and listen to that if you haven't yet. But today, we're looking more at Fields' involvement in this draft process. Ryan Poles kind of making it a point to bring Justin Fields in and communicate with him throughout this process on how this was going to go. We'll talk about Velus Jones, the wide receiver they drafted in the 3rd round. That's going to be a lot more than just a wide receiver for the Bears, and why there's some real reason to be excited about his role in this offense. And we wrap up with the offensive line, the 4 picks they took on day 3, plus a name to watch here in post-draft free agency. That's always fickle here when things can happen quickly. It might even happen by the time you're done listening to this podcast or by the time you start listening to this podcast, things might move quickly here. But a name to keep an eye on there in free agency as well. But let's start with Fields himself, right? Because once again, the conversation after this Bears draft is, well, they didn't take receiver or offensive line in the 2nd round. So therefore, for some reason, that means they don't believe in Fields, or they don't have confidence in Fields, or they don't. I pick your narrative, right? Pick your descriptor for the narrative. And there's so many reasons why that doesn't make sense. But I think Ryan Poles, the general manager himself, also gave us some pretty clear evidence as to why that's not true. That we don't even have to speculate on, some of the logical reasons here of even if they weren't even if it were true that say Ryan Poles isn't a huge Justin Fields fan, he still knows that you need to build around the quarterback position in general, whether it's going to be Fields or say they plan to draft somebody next year or 2 years from now, or whatever. If we're seeing that through, they still know that receivers and offensive linemen are valuable for a quarterback, regardless of whether it's this quarterback or the next quarterback. And so they're not stupid to think that they don't think that, the best strategy is to not give a quarterback offensive lineman and wide receivers. It's just about where their priorities land right now. But more importantly, Poles is making Justin Fields at least involved in this process in a way that I think signals some kind of level of confidence and faith in him, and some sort of involvement in this process that not every quarterback gets. Poles was asked about this yesterday, this idea that quarterbacks want to be involved in this decision-making process. And the question here is, was Justin Fields a part of that?
Ryan, we hear a lot these days about quarterbacks wanting to be aware of, if not involved in some personnel decisions. Yeah. Have you been in touch with Justin at all the last couple of days to keep him up to speed as to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, we actually watched tape together this past weekend, and he was on there. Jones was on there too, on the list. So we watch players, and I want to be able to communicate with my quarterback so he understands from me, kind of the direction we're going and what we're looking at, and he should be, he's the trigger man. He's got the ball in his hand. He should be a part of that.
Would he work with you at all for any of his Ohio State guys?
Yeah, constantly. No, he's actually really cool. He just takes it all in.
What's that back and forth like with him, and what kind of input does he give when you guys are together in that regard?
Yeah, Justin's like a really good listener, so he takes it in, and if there's any questions of why or anything like that, it's easy conversation. He's easy to talk to.
Not every quarterback in the NFL gets to watch tape of draft prospects with their general manager the weekend before the draft. I mean, of course, like that was the whole thing with Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay, feeling like he didn't get enough input on there because even Aaron Rodgers wasn't getting much input in terms of draft direction under Brian Gutekunst. And not that Justin Fields was telling Ryan Poles who to draft. Poles was simply sort of walking him through, hey, here's some of the receiver prospects specifically he talked about there. Like, here's kind of what we like and don't like about these guys. So Fields would understand that going into draft weekend, why maybe they skip on George Pickens and Sky Moore and Alec Pierce in the second round, but are then really excited about Velus Jones in the third round, right? He's bringing the quarterback in so at least that he understands and is, aware of things and not left in the dark wondering why the team is going about things the way they are. And if you didn't believe in or have some faith in your young quarterback, you're really under no obligation to do so, right? Like I said, there's plenty of teams around the NFL that just, not that it's a slight on their quarterback, they just don't really involve their quarterback in too many of those decisions. They'll certainly give them a heads up or whatever, but this is a slight step, I think, above and beyond what you might consider the normal amount of involvement for a potential young quarterback in that spot. I mean, Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers or whoever can be a greater involvement, and Fields is not going to be at that level either in terms of really direct impacts on what he wants to see. But the fact that he's been in on the plans and there's that level of trust of hey, you're involved in this and part of this organizational process moving forward, I think says a lot more about how the organization views Fields than just, they didn't draft receivers and offensive linemen for him in the second round and didn't spend big free agent dollars there that they didn't have. They didn't have big free agent dollars to spend there. That all of a sudden that means they don't trust Fields. I think this is the evidence that says a lot more. And the rest of it is sort of trying to connect dots and craft a storyline there, not to be intentionally anti-Bears. They're just looking for, trying to find an answer as to, why haven't they? Well, maybe the answer is this, but I think the real evidence comes from what Poles was saying there, that no, Fields is involved in this process and aware of how they're going about it, and they just seem to view this team-building strategy a little bit differently than maybe some of the mainstream media takes right now that are skewing this a little bit more anti-Fields. That's not a shot specifically at any one individual media member. I mean, they all got jobs to do, and believe me, I totally understand. It's just part of this process that we're going to go through with this Bears team-building process, especially because they did use the third-round pick at wide receiver, a player that they are really excited about in Velus Jones. It seems to be a big part of the plans for them moving forward and for Justin Fields. We'll learn more about the Tennessee wide receiver, including two big names that Ryan Poles didn't directly compare him to, but name dropped some veteran receivers that he likens to Velus Jones, next on Locked On Bears. Just because we're past the NFL draft and we're a long way to the regular season doesn't mean there aren't bets you can place on your Bears all offseason long. And our friends at BetOnline.net are going to be the top source for all of your betting, stats, and sports information needs. You can find all the latest developments, reviews, and news. We've got odds for futures for this upcoming football season. Bears win total over under 7 right now. Bears odds to make the playoffs are a little bit of a long shot here. Plus, coach of the year, rookie of the year, MVP odds, and so much more. Not just football bets though. Basketball playoffs, well, in the second round now. Hockey playoffs are just getting started. Plus the baseball season. You got soccer, tennis, boxing, UFC, all of your sports wagering information, all from BetOnline, your continued source for live betting, esports, online Vegas casino games, and so much more. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. Building around Justin Fields in this draft started with Velus Jones from Tennessee, one of the older receivers in the draft, and that's, I think, a big part of where some of the criticism comes to the Bears for this pick, just because he's about to turn 25, as though all of a sudden that makes Velus Jones not as good of a football player. I mean, you can argue about, I guess, sort of quote-unquote value, but that doesn't detract from what he is on the field. It's very separate from the type of athlete that the Bears were able to acquire there. And I think, yes, it's not the type of future number one type X wide receiver, they're that big type of game changer on the outside, win down the sideline that you maybe would have wanted with one of those first round wide receivers that the Bears never had a chance at, or maybe Christian Watson could kind of develop into that, but the Packers traded up and got him. Some people thought maybe George Pickens could be there, but clearly the Bears didn't view Pickens nearly that high. No, Velus Jones is not in that type of mold of receiver, but that doesn't mean he can't be a high impact player for the Bears. It's not reasonable to expect a third round pick as a rookie to step in and be a 1,000-yard receiver just off the bat like that. But when you hear Ryan Poles talk here about Velus Jones and what they like about him as a prospect, and I should say too, this is a cut together of I think 3 separate answers with questions in there from the media to Ryan Poles about Velus Jones. You can get a sense of like this vision for them, and there's a reason why Velus Jones was also one of the players they had Justin Fields watch with Ryan Poles before the draft too.
Always looking for those guys that are explosive and they're playmakers, and they can help in many different areas. And that's what this kid is. And when you get a chance to meet him, you'll understand that he's different. He's special. There's something about him. So I would love your feedback after, whenever he comes in, I think probably Thursday. The guy there's an aura about him. And not only can he help our offense, he can help in many different ways. Almost, I'm not going to compare him to Debo, but he has that flexibility where you can put him anywhere, backfield, slot, outside, and then he's a returner, he's a gunner. There's so many different things that he can do. And then always adding that element of speed is important, because as a defense, you have to figure, where is he? You have to find out where he is, and then all of a sudden that opens up other things for other people.
When Sam Somerville was in here, he said Luke was really excited about adding Velus. Yeah. How do you describe kind of what Luke's vision offensively is and how Velus will fit and why that excitement is what it is for him tonight?
Yeah, because you can do different things with him. You can put him in different areas, like I mentioned, backfield, slot, run cool plays with him, misdirections, and again, that's a pain for a defense, not only like on game day, but to prepare for. You got to take the extra step to understand who he is, where he's at, what do they run out of this, and then you can kind of tweak it and change it week to week. So he's definitely excited.
Ryan, with Velus, is it looking at his body of work and kind of the more you can do, taking him over maybe some receivers that had more proven offensive production in college? Do you feel like you can use him in ways that he wasn't utilized in college offensively in the NFL?
Yeah, so when we get him in, we'll take what he did at Tennessee, obviously try to replicate a lot of that, but then also the developmental stage isn't over either. So a lot of times with this, you take what they can do, and then you, just like I've talked about Justin 1,000 times here, it's like you're going to keep developing him and take him into areas and improving route running, improving different things. Again, someone will say I'm not comparing him to Tyreek, but I just remember that transformation that he was like a returner. You remember someone cracked the joke with the Pro Bowl. He's like, oh, he's just a returner. He went to work and they developed him, and he was a route runner. Then all of a sudden, his hands got better. He worked on the jug. So like his game just expanded. So there's a lot of really cool traits. This guy breaks a lot of tackles. He can take the top off. His run after the catch is outstanding. He's big too. He's 5'11", 205 pounds. This isn't like a skinny fast dude. This is a strong, like violent runner. He used to be a running back too. So there's a lot we can do with him.
Ryan Poles there, careful to say he's not comparing Velus Jones to Deebo Samuel and then Tyreek Hill, but he has to kind of know what he's doing when he does name drop two of the NFL's most dynamic weapons last season. Two Pro Bowlers, two All-Pros, two guys that also are, well, one was traded, one on the trade block, potentially for first-round pick plus was sort of the asking price there, and what Tyreek Hill went for, of course, and also two guys that are not first-round picks at wide receiver. That's another interesting connection there. I mean, Tyreek Hill was a fifth-rounder. I know I think there were some off-field concerns there with him coming out of college and stuff, but like Deebo was a second-round pick, 36, so pretty close to the first round, but Velus Jones is a third-round guy. Like, there's always receivers that go outside of the first round that end up becoming greater than what they were in their careers, and what they were in college, and both of those guys, a little bit later on the development side, as Paul said. I think it only took Tyreek Hill a couple of seasons. He was a pretty quick riser. First year, he made the Pro Bowl as the return guy, and then his second year is when he broke 1,000 yards already in that Chiefs offense, which, of course, like, Chiefs offense certainly helps with some of that production process, and I'm sure he's still going to be great in Miami, but, Patrick Mahomes, Tua Tagovailoa, there's an influence there. Deebo Samuel's interesting, though, too, because, like, he didn't break 1,000 yards and really break out as that big-time receiver until this year, and this was year 3 for Deebo Samuel. He had, like, 800 yards as a rookie, right? I mean, there was a lot to like, and I think he had some injury stuff a year or two, or maybe it was COVID. I don't know what his exact situation there, but like Deebo Samuel was not like a super household name until this season. It was a little bit of a slower buildup. Not that he was a nobody the first couple seasons, but just did not come out of the draft year 1 as like, wow, Deebo Samuel, right? So there's that path there for Velus Jones potentially that, like, yeah, he's not going to step out this year and be Deebo Samuel, but like, explosive after the catch, can line him up everywhere, can do a lot of those different things. And if he can get the proper development from a very well-respected wide receivers coach on the Bears in Tyke Tolbert, who has a track record of developing receivers and coaching high-quality wide receivers at every single stop, there's a lot to like there. And you can kind of look at that and say, maybe he's not a true number 2 right now, and the Bears don't have quite a true number 1, but between Mooney and then Velus Jones with some playmaking ability, and maybe Pringle or Nicodemus St. Brown and David Moore can give you a little bit of something. It's not a great wide receiving core by any means. But you look around the NFL, Lamar Jackson does not have a great wide receiving core right now. Aaron Rodgers does not have a great wide receiving core right now. There's a lot of teams that still have some big holes at wide receiver, still some opportunities out there to add more players. The Bears already have a couple of undrafted free agents brought in, maybe some other guys available for trade or later on in the offseason. This roster is not fully set, including on the offensive line, where it still seems like the Bears are pretty inclined to at least add one more free agent to go with 4 draft picks at that spot. We'll break down the newest players on the team, how they might fit into this rotation, this depth chart, and we'll point out one name that just became available to keep an eye on here for the Bears offensive line in free agency as well, next on Locked On Bears. So many different picks and trades. There's a lot of moving parts in this draft, and nobody knows moving parts better than our friends at rockauto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. They've got everything you could possibly need for your vehicle, from engine control modules and fuel pump assemblies to easier stuff like brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. So whatever you need, rockauto.com has it. It's super easy to search through their catalog. All you do is enter in your car's make and model, and then you can quickly sort between all the different brands, specifications, and prices that you prefer. Those prices are particularly important because a lot of the chain part stores will have a different price tier for professional mechanics versus do-it-yourselfers like us. But rockauto.com's prices are the same for everybody. So don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. It feels like the Chicago Bears still need at least one more part to this offensive line, but they really addressed a lot of the depth with some upside potential here with those offensive line picks on day 3. And I'm not going to get on here and tell you that, the 2 6th-round picks and the 7th-round pick are going to be starters this season. And really, chances are that none of the 3 of them develop into anything particularly notable. But I do think taking 4 of them is 4 times the chances that someone does develop into something notable. And clearly, I think Braxton Jones, the 5th-round pick from Southern Utah, is kind of the big one to circle. I mean, there's a reason he was taken first out of the group, and really a player that the Bears seem to prioritize heading into the draft. Like, we didn't know it at the time, but now it's coming out that they really did prioritize him heading into this draft. Apparently, like, really late in the process, like just last week or so before the draft, They brought him in or visited him, I don't know where it was, for like one last extra workout. They sent their assistant offensive line coach to really spend more time with him in person, and that really confirmed it for him, for this organization, as like a guy they really wanted to get out of this draft. When you look at him on tape, you can really tell right away he's got a really strong upper body and really long arms. He's almost like top heavy in a weird way. Like his legs look kind of small comparatively, and that's, I think, part of why he fell. Some teams prefer offensive linemen to have a little bit more bulk in the pants, but that doesn't mean he can't still be a quality player there. Moves really, really well. I think a 3-year starter at left tackle for them, or 2 or 3-year starter, and smooth out in space. I think there's that question too about the level of competition at Southern Utah and how that will sort of translate to the NFL, and why maybe you wouldn't expect him to step in necessarily as the day one or at least week one starter at left tackle if you were going to then move Tevin Jenkins to right tackle and Larry Borum inside the guard, or however you might, or even Tevin Jenkins inside the guard, I guess. I mean, those are all possibilities, but I think they're not going to set a ceiling on it. They're going to let these guys compete and make it an open, fresh slate for everybody, open competition. Winner's going to win, and nobody besides, I guess, Cody Whitehair and Lucas Patrick at this point are guaranteed anything on this offensive line in terms of true opportunity. But Jones is a guy that a lot of people are saying the Bears got good value there in the draft, that he was expected to go a little bit earlier than that. And some of that Larry Borum type of steal feeling that, again, not that he's going to be ready to go week one, but maybe has a better chance of developing into something that could be a starting caliber offensive tackle. And if he does need to get pressed into action due to injuries or whatever reason, you feel a little bit more confident than you might in your typical 5th round pick on the offensive line. You move into the 6th round, they took Zachary Thomas from San Diego State, an offensive tackle. Well, he played offensive tackle in college, but maybe projected a little bit more into guard. He was a 3-year starter. He started at left tackle and right tackle. He actually did play some guard earlier in his career, which is, I think, part of why that transition inside seems a little bit more natural. But kind of like Braxton Jones, long arms, strong hands. Some pretty good experience there too, but not very explosive out of his stance, and doesn't recover super, super well because he's not that explosive mover in space. And so that's why I think the projection there is more into guard. Pretty solid run blocking. It was a very run-heavy offense, I think, at San Diego State as well. So you think in the interior, he can kind of get a hold of guys and move them and not be asked to have so much space around him, might be a better fit. And that length helps, certainly, on the inside as well. Doug Kramer from Illinois, not so much the traits guy, the other 6th round pick. He was a 5-year starter at center for Illinois because of the COVID year. So, I mean, one of the most experienced players in this draft. He's quick, he's smart, he's got good technique, very sort of well-rounded prospect, but he falls to the 6th round for a reason. And I think it's sort of that idea of a low ceiling. The Bears aren't going to put a low ceiling on him, but from an evaluation standpoint, it looks like kind of that high floor, low ceiling player that could just carve out that role as a backup center for 10 or 15 years, but never becomes that every game starter there. But when you put him in, it feels like he can kind of hold his own, because he does have a little bit of shorter arms there, and he's a little bit undersized, so that he just doesn't have those potentially special traits there, but just a solid, reliable type of backup that. And he also never played other positions besides center. So there's a little bit of a translation there if you want him to try and be more versatile. Otherwise, if he's center only, that can reduce some of his value as well. But he seems fairly pro-ready in that regard. And I think that's some real push for Sam Mustipher there. They have been trying Mustipher at guard, and maybe that's the plan, that Mustipher can play guard, and a guy like Doug Kramer can be your true backup center as a rookie. I mean, maybe he's on the practice squad too, and they just make Mustipher the backup center, but there's a real possibility there. And then they wrapped up in the 7th round with Ja'Tyre Carter from Southern University. Just like Jones and Thomas, right? Long-armed offensive tackles seem to be where the Bears have gone, at least in this draft, under Ryan Poles. 4-year starter at left tackle, a little bit more of that thicker in the lower half, but pretty flexible and smooth, but kind of like Zachary Thomas, not really explosive, doesn't have a lot of burst out of his stance. And so as a result, because he knows he's not as quick, when you watch his tape, you can see him overset. He'll get too wide to try and overcompensate. He'll push himself out too far because he just feels like he has to get out there in space, and then he'll give up the inside because he's trying so hard to get up space. So there's fear of how he'll handle NFL speed off the edge and being able to recover if he does either need to get out faster or need to get back inside. So again, projected a little bit more inside the guard, but when you have both of these guys who mostly played tackle in their careers trying to play guard, I would think it lowers the chances of them making that year one impact. For me, I think both Zachary Thomas from San Diego State and Ja'Tyre Carter from Southern are the stronger practice squad candidates this year, whereas I think Braxton Jones is a pretty strong candidate to be on the roster and maybe even play at some point, and Doug Kramer seemed a little more pro-ready to be that backup center this season. I still think a free agent is still in the possibilities here, and just yesterday on Monday, the Philadelphia Eagles released Nate Herbig. He was a restricted free agent that signed his tender, and he sort of like asked or was trying to leave the contract, and the Eagles let him go. He graded really well in run blocking. He played both guard spots. Been a starter for them a couple of different years now. And of course, the Bears' assistant general manager now under Ryan Poles is Ian Cunningham, who was in the Eagles front office. So it's pretty easy to connect the dots there for the Bears to potentially bring him in. I'd imagine they might be looking at other free agent offensive linemen, but they might wait until after rookie minicamp, bring in the tryout players and their drafted players, see how they actually look on the field practicing with your guys, and then sort of reevaluate from there. Okay, how much faith do we have in these rookies, or do we need to go out and sign that veteran? And I think that's probably more the timeline we're looking at for the Bears to make post-draft free agent additions at any position, wide receiver, offensive line, wherever, defensive line as well, probably in that conversation. So whatever the Bears end up doing with those free agents, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube and our video podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Coming up this week, we'll talk to some of our draft analyst friends. We'll talk to some of our Locked On Podcast Network friends that covered these prospects in college to really get that sort of in-depth understanding, mainly on the early picks. So we're not going to spend a lot of time breaking down all the 6th and 7th round picks because, not everyone's going to be as interested in them, but especially those 2nd and 3rd round guys, we're going to try and do as deep of a dive as we can. So I hope you'll keep tuning back in. Hope you'll keep enjoying Locked On Bears, and I hope that the podcast helps make it a little bit easier for you to bear down.